The wilderness was never kind to those who didn't belong. Clara Whitmore knew this truth as the stagecoach jolted across the narrow trail high in the mountains, snow biting at the air even though it was late autumn. She had been bound for a remote settlement on the frontier, hoping to visit a distant cousin who promised her a chance at a new life away from the suffocating expectations of the city. But fate had other plans. The coach had gone off balance after a wheel snapped on a hidden rock. Horses screamed, men cursed, and then chaos, the crack of splintering wood, the sickening tilt, and the world spinning. When Clara came to, the wreck lay scattered across the ravine, the driver and passengers already gone. Some fled, some too broken to move. She walked for hours through biting wind, her boots sinking in patches of early snow, her once fine dress torn and muddied. By the time dusk stretched across the jagged peaks, her breath came in white clouds, each one thinner than the last. The shadows thickened and the eerie silence of the wilderness pressed on her ears. Wolves howled far off and the sound made her blood run cold. Clara pressed on, shivering violently, until she caught sight of a faint glow flickering through the trees. A light. Her weary feet carried her toward it, her heart pounding with both hope and dread. The cabin appeared at the edge of a clearing, rough-hewn logs stacked with the care of a man who knew the forest better than any town street. Smoke curled from the chimney, glowing orange against the deepening night. Clara's relief nearly buckled her knees. She climbed the short set of crude steps and raised her trembling hand to knock. Before she could, the heavy door creaked open. Man filled the doorway. Tall, broad-shouldered. His hair fell in loose, tangled strands around his face, and his beard was thick, shadowing a jaw set hard as stone. His shirt hung open at the collar, showing a chest carved by labor and solitude. His eyes wild, piercing blue beneath heavy brows, locked on her as though she were some ghost blown in by the storm. Clara froze. The man's hand gripped the door frame, his knuckles white. His voice was low, rough like gravel dragged across. "Wood, you'd best keep moving, lady. Ain't nothing safe for you here." Her lips parted, but her voice caught in her throat. She steadied herself and tried again. "My coach had overturned. I've nowhere else to go, please." His gaze narrowed. He glanced past her, scanning the tree line as if expecting trouble to follow. Then his eyes returned, sharp and unwavering. "You don't understand." He stepped forward, the firelight from inside throwing his face into stark relief. "I've been too long out here alone, too long without company. You'd be safer keeping your distance from me." Clara shuddered, not from the cold this time, but from the weight of his warning. He wasn't threatening her. Not exactly. His words carried something else, something raw, as though he were warning her against a danger that lived in himself. But the wilderness behind her hissed with the wind, and another wolf's howl curled through the trees, closer this time. Her courage rose against her fear. She lifted her chin. "Sir, I don't frighten easy. I only ask for shelter, nothing more." For a long moment, the man didn't move. His chest rose and fell, heavy with restraint. Then, slowly, he stepped back, giving her space to enter. "You'll regret stepping through that door," he muttered, almost to himself. Clara crossed the threshold. The cabin was dim but warm, the scent of burning pine mingling with leather and wood smoke. A rough table stood near the hearth, a cot pushed against the wall, and shelves lined with jars, tools, and weapons. It was the dwelling of a man who lived far beyond the edges of civilization. He shut the door behind her, the sound echoing like a lock on fate. Turning, he studied her again, this city woman in tattered skirts, with fire in her eyes despite the cold biting her cheeks. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said softly, as if formality could cut through the unease. He didn't offer his name at first. He only stared, his expression unreadable. Then, with a grunt, He moved to the fire and tossed another log onto the flames. "Elias Kane," he said finally. His voice was quieter now, though no less rough. Clara stepped closer to the hearth, letting its heat chase away her trembling. She should have been afraid, truly afraid of this wild, solitary man who had warned her against himself. Yet some instinct deep within whispered that her journey had brought her to his door for a reason. And though Elias Kane stood stiff and unwelcoming, his eyes betrayed the truth he could not say. Her presence had already unsettled the wild within him. Asterisk. Fire snapped and popped, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Clara stood with her hands stretched toward the warmth, her fingers still trembling. Behind her, Elias Kane moved with a deliberate heaviness, as if every step, every breath, was weighed down by something unseen. She stole a glance over her shoulder. He was taller than she had realized, broad enough that the cabin seemed smaller with him inside it. His shirt was rough spun, sleeves rolled up over forearms marked with old scars. He poured something from a pot into a tin cup, the motion practiced, steady, unbothered by her presence, or at least pretending to be. "Drink," he said, setting the steaming cup down on the rough-hewn table. Clara hesitated before crossing the room to take it. The liquid was bitter, but warm, seeping life back into her frozen body. She murmured her thanks, but Elias gave no reply. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching her with the same guarded intensity as before. At last, she broke the silence. "Why do you say I'd be safer keeping my distance? Surely you don't mean to harm me?" The faintest flicker passed across his face, something between amusement and warning. He shook his head, strands of dark hair falling over his brow. "Harm you? No, that's the trouble." Her brow furrowed. "I don't understand." Elias pushed off from the wall, pacing a few slow steps closer. The firelight cast shadows across his face, sharpening the wild angles, softening nothing. His voice was low, gruff. "You come in here looking like some porcelain doll that's been dropped in the mud. Fine dress, soft hands, eyes wide as a deer's. I've been out here 5 years without a soul to talk to, without—" He stopped himself, jaw tightening. "Without a woman anywhere near. You think that don't matter, Miss Whitmore? It does. It eats at a man." Clara's breath caught, though not in fear. There was a raw honesty in his tone, stripped of politeness, stripped of all the measured manners she had known in the city. She should have been scandalized. Instead, she found herself holding his gaze, her pulse quickening. "I'm not afraid." "Of you," she said softly. Elias let out a sharp breath, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You should be." Silence stretched between them. The wind moaned outside, rattling the shutters. Clara's grip tightened around the tin cup. She had known men who smiled sweetly in parlors, their words polished like silver, but behind their charm lay lies and cruelty. Elias Kane was different. He wore his warning openly, as though daring her to leave before she found herself tangled in whatever storm raged inside him. But Clara had nowhere to go. And more than that, something about him drew her. "I survived a wreck today," she said after a moment, her voice steady. "I walked through the cold for hours. I've stared death in the eye already. Mr. Kane, you don't frighten me half as much as the thought of being out there again alone." For the first time, his gaze softened. Not much, but enough that she saw the man beneath the beast, the weariness, the loneliness carved deep in him. He turned away, rubbing a hand over his face as if frustrated with himself. "Blast it," he muttered. "You'll stay then. But you listen to me, Clara Whitmore. You keep your distance. You sleep on that cot by the wall, and I'll take the floor. You don't mistake my kindness for anything more. Because if you do," his voice dropped, rough as the bark of a pine, "I won't be able to hold myself back." Her heart thundered in her chest. She should have been ashamed, should have looked away. Instead, she set the cup down and stepped nearer, just enough that the firelight caught the gold in her hair. "I trust you," she whispered. Elias stared at her as though she'd struck him. His jaw worked, muscles tense, but he said nothing more. At last he grabbed a fur blanket from a shelf and tossed it onto the cot. Then he turned his back, lowering himself onto the floorboards by the hearth. Clara lay down on the narrow cot, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. She closed her eyes, but sleep did not come. She could feel him there, every breath, every shift of his body against the creaking floorboards. And though he had warned her, though danger seemed to pulse in the very air of the cabin, Clara realized something unsettling. She wasn't afraid at all, if anything, she was more afraid of herself, because already, against all sense, she wanted to see just how far Elias Kane's warning would go. Morning came quietly, with pale light slipping through the cracks between the logs. Clara stirred on the cot, her body stiff from a night of restless half-sleep. The fur blanket smelled faintly of pine and smoke, rough against her cheek. She sat up slowly, her gaze falling to the man stretched out on the floor by the fire. Elias Kane lay on his back, one arm bent beneath his head, the other resting across his chest. Even in sleep, he looked like a man prepared for battle, his body taut, his face shadowed with something that never quite loosened. Clara watched him for a moment, struck by the strange safety she felt in the cabin of a man who had all but told her she should fear him. She slipped from the cot quietly, trying not to wake him, but the creak of the floorboards betrayed her. His eyes opened instantly sharp, alert, like a hunter sensing movement in the woods. "You're awake early," he said, voice rough with sleep. "I couldn't rest," Clara admitted. She clasped her hands together, suddenly self-conscious beneath his piercing gaze. "I thought perhaps I could help, with whatever it is you do here." He sat up, running a hand through his tangled hair. A small frown tugged at his mouth. "Help? City women don't know much about mountain living." Clara stiffened, her chin lifting. "You'd be surprised what I can manage. I may not have lived in a cabin before, but I am not useless, Mr. Kane." His brow arched at her defiance, and for a moment he almost smiled. Almost. Then he rose, stretching to his full height, towering over her once again. "We'll see." He handed her a bucket and gestured toward the door. "Water. Creeks. About a quarter-mile down. Watch your footing." The icy wind bit at Clara's cheeks as she stepped outside. The cabin sat nestled in a clearing, ringed by towering pines and jagged peaks beyond. The beauty was savage, wild, nothing like the manicured gardens and cobbled streets of the city. Every sound carried sharp and clear, the rush of the creek, the distant cry of a hawk, the rustle of branches in the wind. She returned some time later, breathless from the climb, her boots muddy and her skirts damp. Elias took the bucket without a word, setting it near the hearth. His eyes flicked over her flushed cheeks, her wind-tossed hair, but he said nothing. Instead, he handed her a knife and pointed toward a pile of vegetables on the table. "Think you can manage to cut those without slicing off a finger?" Clara narrowed her eyes at him but sat down, determined. She worked slowly, carefully, the blade awkward in her hand. Elias busied himself with mending a leather strap, glancing up every so often. When she nicked her finger, hissing at the sting, he was at her side in an instant, taking her hand in his rough, calloused ones. "You'll bleed more out here than "You will in your fancy parlors," he muttered, wrapping a strip of cloth around the small cut. His touch was careful, though his voice carried its usual edge. Clara met his eyes, her breath catching at the unexpected gentleness beneath his gruffness. "You think I've never struggled," she said quietly, "but you don't know me." Elias's gaze lingered on her a moment longer before he pulled back, returning to his work. "Maybe not, but I know you're kind, polished, soft, Out here, the mountains don't care about fine manners. They'll chew you up and spit you out." She straightened in her chair, her pride bristling. "And yet I'm still here, still standing." That earned her a long look, steady, unreadable. Then, for the first time, the corner of his mouth curved into something almost like a smile, though it was fleeting. "Maybe you've got more steel in you than I thought." The rest of the morning passed in a rhythm Clara had never known. Elias showed her how to stack wood properly, how to feed the fire without smothering it, how to tie bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, there was purpose in every syllable. She, in turn, filled the silence with questions about the land, about how he came to live so far from civilization. Most of her questions he ignored. But when she pressed gently, asking why he chose solitude over society, his jaw tightened. "Men back there ain't worth the dirt under their boots," he said finally. "Cities full of liars and cowards. Out here, the mountain don't lie. It tells you plain whether you're strong enough to stay standing." Clara wanted to ask more, but the shadow in his voice warned her not to push. Still, she understood a little better now. The wilderness had shaped him, hardened him. But it had also given him something no city could, a truth that cut sharp and cleaned out as the sun dipped low. Painting the peaks in firelight, Clara realized how far her world was from his. She was refined, he was raw. She came from order, he lived in chaos. And yet, despite the chasm between them, a thread was already tying their fates together. When Elias finally spoke again, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of certainty. "You don't belong here, Clara Whitmore. But the longer you stay, the harder it'll be for either of us to let you go." The first snowflakes drifted down in the late afternoon, lazy and harmless against the fading sun. Clara stood at the window, watching the white specks melt as they touched the sill. She had never seen the mountains cloaked in snow before, and for a moment, she thought it beautiful like a painting, but Elias Kane didn't look at it with wonder. When he stepped inside after chopping wood, his jaw was set hard, eyes lifting to the gray sky. He stamped the snow from his boots, dropping the axe by the door. "It's coming fast," he muttered. Clara turned from the window. "The snow? The storm?" His voice carried a weight that pressed the room cold despite the fire. "Could be a day. Could be a week. Once it sets in, we won't be stepping foot outside." The warning sank into her chest. She glanced at the small cabin walls of logs, shelves lined with jars and dried goods, a single hearth, enough to keep them alive, perhaps, but trapped together. The thought sent a strange shiver through her. By nightfall, the storm arrived in full. The wind roared through the pines, shaking the cabin like a giant's hand. Snow slammed against the shutters, howling in every crack. The fire hissed and spat, the only warmth in a world turned white and merciless. Clara sat near the hearth, the blanket pulled around her shoulders, her eyes wide at every thunderous gust. Across the room, Elias worked quietly, running a whetstone along the edge of a hunting knife, his movements calm, steady, as though the fury outside was nothing new. "How can you be so calm?" she asked finally, her voice barely carrying above. "The storm." He didn't look up. "Storms don't scare me. They remind me what's real. Out there, it's just nature doing what it was made to do. Nothing deceitful about it." Clara hugged the blanket tighter. "And what about in here?" That made him pause, his hand stilled on the knife. Slowly, he lifted his gaze, and the firelight caught his eyes blue, fierce, unsettled. "In here is different." The silence that followed was thicker than the storm outside. Clara's pulse quickened, though she forced herself to meet his gaze. She could feel the charge in the air, as if the storm had crept through the walls and settled between them. Elias set the knife aside with a deliberate motion. He leaned forward, bracing his forearms on his knees. "I told you before. You'd be safer keeping your distance from me. Trapped like this, 4 walls, nothing but time." That warning stands stronger than ever. Clara's lips parted, but no words came. His voice wasn't a threat, it was raw confession. He was fighting something inside himself, something fierce and hungry. She could almost feel the strain in him, the way his hands curled into fists, the way his chest rose heavy with restraint. She swallowed, her voice soft. "Do you think I don't see it? The way you look at me? The way you try not to?" Elias's jaw clenched, his breath leaving him sharp, like a man struck. He pushed to his feet, pacing toward the fire as though distance might steady him. But when he spoke, his voice was low, rougher than the storm outside. "You've got no idea, Clara. I've been alone out here too long. A man starts to forget himself. Starts to hunger for things he ought to keep buried. You walk in here, soft and beautiful, smelling of soap and city air, and I can't think straight." The words struck her like fire. Fear should have risen in her, but instead, a different heat coursed through her veins. She rose slowly, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, her breath quick and shallow. Then stopped fighting. She whispered. Elias turned sharply, his eyes blazing. For a heartbeat, he stood frozen, as though on the edge of a cliff, torn between restraint and surrender. Then, with a ragged breath, he forced himself back. He shook his head, his voice harsh with the effort of control. "No, you don't understand what you're asking." Clara stepped closer, her courage trembling but alive. "I understand enough. You're not the monster you think you are, Elias Kane." He stared at her, chest heaving, the storm screaming outside like it echoed the war inside him. Slowly, he lifted a hand, hovering inches from her face, fingers trembling. But he didn't touch her. He couldn't. Instead, he dropped his hand, stepping back like a man retreating from fire. "Go to the cot, Clara. Sleep. This storm will pass." But as she lay down, listening to the roar outside and the silence between them, Clara knew the storm inside Elias Kane would not pass so easily. And she wasn't sure she wanted it to. The storm raged for 2 more days without pause. Snow piled high against the door, sealing them inside. The wind howled like wolves circling the cabin, and the cold pressed sharp against the walls despite the fire that burned without rest. Clara had never known confinement like it. The city's parlors and drawing rooms had been prisons of another kind: polite words, false smiles, and suffocating expectation. But here, the prison was real. 4 walls of timber, a man she barely knew, and a silence heavy with the things neither dared to speak. On the 3rd evening, the air felt too thick to breathe. Clara sat at the table, needle in hand, stitching at a torn seam on her dress more for distraction than necessity. Across from her, Elias worked at carving a handle for a knife, his strong hands moving with deliberate precision. But the longer she watched him, the less steady her stitches became. His forearms flexed with each motion, scars catching the firelight. His jaw was set tight, lips pressed in a line that betrayed the battle inside him. At last, she broke the silence. "You can't keep doing this." His knife paused mid-cut. Slowly his eyes lifted to hers, wary. "Doing what?" "Pretending you don't feel it," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "This, whatever it is between us. You act like it's a danger, like I should run from it. But I don't want to run." Elias set the knife down with a sharp thunk. He leaned back in his chair, staring at her like a man staring down a storm front. "You don't know what you're asking." Clara laid her sewing aside, her pulse hammering. "Then show me." The words hung in the air like sparks leaping from the fire. Elias's jaw clenched. He stood abruptly, pacing to the hearth, gripping the mantel as though it were the only thing anchoring him. His voice came rough, broken. Damn it, Clara. I've kept myself in check for years. Out here, you learn control or you die. But you, he turned, eyes blazing, his chest rising hard with each breath. You undo me. Every glance, every word. I can't think straight with you in this cabin, and if I let go... He broke off, fists curling at his sides. Clara rose, her feet unsteady, but she crossed the room anyway. She stopped just a breath. Away from him, tilting her face up to his. The firelight painted his features in gold and shadow, every line of him carved from solitude and restraint. If you let go, she whispered, then don't stop yourself on my account. Elias's breath hitched. His hand lifted, trembling, hovering near her cheek. For days he had fought this moment. For years, perhaps, he had fought the hunger to reach for someone human, when his calloused fingers finally brushed. Her skin, Clara shivered, not with fear, but with a heat that cut through the winter's chill. He bent his head, lips hovering near hers, so close she felt the warmth of his breath. His eyes searched hers, desperate, pleading for her to turn away, to save them both. But she didn't. She closed the distance. The kiss was not gentle, it was fire meeting dry timber. Years of loneliness, days of restraint, all breaking loose. In an instant, his arms wrapped around her, pulling her against the breadth of his chest, and she clung to him as though the storm outside had found its echo within them. When at last he tore himself back, his forehead pressed to hers, his breath ragged, his voice shook. Clara, if I start down this road, I won't stop. You need to be sure. Her hands cupped his face, steady despite her racing heart. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. For a long moment, Elias simply stared at her, as though trying to read the truth in her eyes. Then, with a groan that was half surrender, half relief, he kissed her again, slower this time, deeper, sealing the choice they had both already made. The storm outside roared, but it was nothing compared to the one inside the cabin. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Clara didn't feel like a stranded woman waiting to be saved. She felt like she had chosen her place in the arms of the man who had tried so hard to warn her away. When the storm broke at last, it did so with a silence almost more unnerving than the roar of the wind. Snow lay heavy across the clearing, piled to the window ledges, sparkling beneath the weak light of dawn. Clara rose from the cot, her body aching, her heart still trembling with the memory of Elias's arms around her. He stood by the door, staring out through a crack in the shutter. His broad shoulders were stiff, his posture tense as though the storm had left something unsettled inside him. You're awake, she said softly. He turned, eyes shadowed. Storm's over. Won't be easy. Moving through that snow, but it'll pass. You'll get back to town soon enough. The words landed like stones in her chest. Soon enough. As though what had passed between them was nothing more than weather, bound to vanish with the storm. She swallowed hard. Do you want me to go? Elias's gaze flicked away, his jaw working. He didn't answer at once. When he did, his voice was low, rough, wants got nothing to do with it. A man like me doesn't get to keep what don't belong in his world. Clara stepped closer, searching his face. And what world is that, Elias? You speak as though you're something less than a man. But you've given me shelter, warmth, protection. You've shown me more kindness than many men in my city ever did. Why do you believe you're so dangerous? His eyes hardened, but not. At her, at the ghosts behind his gaze. He turned back to the fire, bracing his hands against the mantel. His voice carried the weight of years left unspoken, because I know what I'm capable of. The silence stretched until Clara thought he might close himself off again. But then he spoke, each word pulled like a thorn from his chest. 5 years ago, I lived among men. Worked the logging camps, broke horses, did whatever needed doing. Had friends, or so I thought, Had a fiancé even. Thought I'd build a life. His voice caught, then hardened. But greed has a way of rotting men from the inside. A partner cheated me, left me with nothing. And when I confronted him, I put him in the ground. Clara's breath hitched. She should have recoiled, should have feared him. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. They called it murder, Elias went on, his jaw tight. But the law didn't care who swung first or why I had blood on my hands. All they saw was another roughneck with a temper. I ran before they could hang me. Left everything behind. Came up here to these mountains, where the only judgment comes from winter and hunger. He turned, his gaze fierce, daring her to see the monster he believed himself to be. So you ask why I warn you? Why I tell you to keep your distance? That's why? Because I've seen what my hands can do, Clara, and if I lose myself again, his voice cracked, raw with fear, it won't just be some cheating partner who pays the price. For a long moment, Clara said nothing. The fire snapped between them, casting shadows that seemed to echo the weight of his confession. Then, slowly, she reached for his hand. His fingers curled instinctively away, but she caught them, holding firm. You are not the man you fear you are, she whispered. I've seen men with polished boots and perfect manners who carry cruelty in their hearts. You may have blood on your hands, Elias Kane, but I see something else in you too. I see a man who would rather warn me away than take what he wants. That is not the mark of a beast, it is the mark of a man with honor. His breath shuddered, his hand trembling in hers. For the first time, his walls cracked. His shoulders slumped, the hardness in his face softening, leaving behind something weary and wounded. You don't know what you're saying, he murmured, but Clara only tightened her grip. Yes, I do. You've lived so long believing you're alone, that the only way to survive is to bury the man you were. But I don't believe he's gone. I believe he's right here, standing in front of me. Elias's throat worked as though words had failed him. Slowly, he lifted his free hand, cupping her cheek with a tenderness that broke her heart. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. Clara Whitmore, you don't know what you've done to me. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. Maybe. I've simply reminded you who you are. The fire crackled, snow glistened outside, and in that small cabin, the wilderness seemed less cruel than it had before. For the first time in years, Elias Kane allowed himself to believe he might not be lost entirely to the shadows. The snow began to melt over the next days, the white blanket shrinking back to reveal the rugged earth beneath. Clara had grown used to the rhythm of the cabin Elias chopping wood, her tending the fire and boiling broth from what meager supplies he had. She found peace in the quiet moments, in the way the mountains seemed to listen rather than judge. But peace in the wilderness was always fragile. Happened near dusk. Clara was gathering snow in a bucket by the cabin door when she saw them three figures trudging through the drifts from the tree line. At first she thought them weary travelers like herself, but the way they moved confident, predatory, sent a chill down her spine. Elias? She whispered, her voice tight. He appeared at her shoulder in an instant, his body stiffening as his gaze fell on the men. Their rifles glinted in the fading light, and their laughter carried through the still air. Bandits, Elias muttered. Should have known the storm would flush vermin down the slopes. The men reached the clearing, their boots crunching in the snow. The tallest stepped forward, a scar dragging one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. Well, he drawled. Didn't think anyone lived this far up. Looks like we struck gold, boys a warm cabin, some supplies, and company. His eyes slid to Clara, and she felt her stomach twist. Elias stepped forward, towering and broad, placing himself between her and the intruders. You're not welcome here. Turn back. The scarred man chuckled, not the least bit cowed. Easy. Now, mountain man, We're just looking to share your fire. Unless you're saying we ain't invited?" Elias's voice was like gravel. "That's exactly what I'm saying." The second man, wiry and sharp-eyed, lifted his rifle in a lazy gesture. "Careful, friend. You wouldn't want things to get ugly." Clara's heart pounded. She could feel the storm in Elias, the tension in his frame, the very danger he had warned her about. For a moment she feared he might explode, that his confession of violence would become prophecy. But when he spoke again, his voice was cold, measured. "You take one step closer, and I'll make sure none of you walk away." The scarred leader's smile faltered. He glanced at his men, weighing their odds. Then, with a mock bow, he said, "Maybe we'll just lighten your load then. Food, pelts, anything worth carrying." Elias didn't move. "You tried to take one thing from this cabin, you'll regret it." The standoff stretched, heavy as the snow clouds above. Clara gripped the doorframe, her breath caught in her throat. She had seen Elias wrestle wood and carve through the frozen earth, but now she saw the man forged for moments like this, unyielding, fierce, protective. The wiry man shifted, raising his rifle higher. It was a mistake. Elias moved like a striking bear. He lunged forward, seizing the rifle's barrel and wrenching it free. With a twist, he slammed the butt into the man's chest, sending him sprawling in the snow. The third bandit shouted, firing his pistol. The shot cracked through the clearing, splintering wood from the cabin wall. Clara cried out, but Elias was already upon him. He barreled into the man, his fist slamming hard, knocking the pistol free. The man crumpled. Only the scarred leader remained, his grin gone, replaced with a snarl. He lifted his weapon too slow. Elias grabbed him by the coat, dragging him close until their faces were inches apart. "Next time you set foot on this mountain," Elias growled, "you won't leave alive." With a shove, he sent the man stumbling back into the snow. The others scrambled to their feet, half dragging one another toward the trees. They vanished into the gathering dark, their curses trailing behind. Silence fell heavy. Clara's hands shook as she clutched the doorway. Elias stood in the snow, chest heaving, his knuckles bloodied. For a moment, he looked every inch the dangerous man he had claimed to be. But then his gaze found hers, and she saw not rage but fear. Fear that she had witnessed too much, that she would now see him as the brute he believed himself to be. She crossed the snow, her skirts brushing against the drifts, and placed her hand against his arm. "You didn't lose yourself," she whispered. "You protected me." His breath trembled, his shoulders sagging as though her words had broken through his armor. Slowly, he nodded, though his eyes still burned with doubt. "Maybe," he said, softly, "but it took everything in me not to go further." "You don't know how close I came." Clara held tighter. "Then it only proves what I told you. You are not lost, Elias Kane. You chose restraint. You chose me." In that moment, the test had been passed not by his fists, but by his will. For the first time, Elias let her lean into him, not as a burden, but as someone he needed just as much as she needed him. The bandits never returned. Perhaps it was fear, or perhaps the mountain itself had turned them away, but their absence left behind a silence deeper than before. The cabin seemed changed after that night, less a prison of snow and solitude, and more a sanctuary, forged by trial and defended with fire. For Clara, the days slipped into a rhythm she had never imagined for herself. She awoke to the sound of Elias splitting wood, his broad back rising and falling with every strike. She stirred pots over the fire, mended torn fabric with clumsy stitches, and learned to grind herbs he gathered. Each task was small, yet together they formed a life. But the thaw brought more than green shoots. It brought choice. One morning, as Clara stood outside the cabin, she spotted movement on the lower trail. This time, it wasn't bandits. It was a pair of riders, their coats marked with the emblem of a stage line. A rescue party. Her breath caught. Civilization had come for her. She turned to Elias, who had stepped out behind her, an axe resting against his shoulder. His eyes narrowed as he followed her gaze. "Looks like your world's come calling," he muttered. The riders hailed them with waves, calling that they'd been sent to search for survivors after the stage accident. Relief and dread tangled in Clara's chest. She should have felt only joy, but instead her heart twisted, as if the cabin's rough-hewn walls had already claimed a piece of her. Inside, as she packed the few belongings she'd arrived with mud-stained skirts, a half-ruined valise, Elias stood silent by the fire. The weight of his silence pressed heavier than the blizzard ever had. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, as though dragged out against his will. "You'll be safer down there. Folks to tend you, to give you back the life you had." Clara turned, her hands trembling. "And what of the life I have now?" He met her gaze for the first time, raw honesty burning in his eyes. "This life, it's no life for you. It's hard and lonely. I ain't fit for your world, Clara, and I don't want to drag you into mine." She crossed the room, her steps firm. "You think I don't see the truth? That I don't know what you've been fighting?" Her hand pressed to his chest, steady, against the thrum of his heart. "Yes, you're wild, Elias Kane. Yes, you frighten even yourself. But you're also the man who carried me from the snow, who kept me warm, who protected me when others would have left me to fend for myself." He swallowed hard, his jaw tight. "I told you I can't control myself around you." "And I told you," she whispered fiercely, "that maybe you don't have to. Maybe what you need isn't control, it's trust." The words hung between them, fragile yet unbreakable. Outside, the riders called again, urging her to come. The path to the city awaited. Safety, society, everything she had once believed she wanted. But when she looked back at Elias, she knew none of it could replace what she had found in the wilderness. A man scarred but unbroken. A love carved from silence and survival. Slowly, she turned away from the door. "I'm not leaving," she sighed. Elias's eyes widened, disbelief flashing across his face. "Clara, I choose this," she interrupted. Her voice trembled, but her resolve did not. "I choose you." For a long moment, Elias said nothing. Then, with a rough sound that was half laugh, half sob, he pulled her into his arms. His hold was fierce, as though he had been starving for this very moment. Clara clung to him, her cheek pressed against his chest, feeling the steady beat of a heart that had finally allowed itself to be claimed. When the riders left, confused but respectful of her choice, the cabin grew quiet again. Yet the silence was no longer empty. It was full of warmth, of promise, of the life they would build together. That night, as the fire crackled and the mountains loomed dark beyond the windows, Elias tilted her chin to meet his gaze. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice thick with wonder and doubt. Clara smiled, soft but unyielding. "I've never been more sure of anything." He kissed her then, not with the hesitation of a man afraid of his own strength, but with the certainty of one who had finally found where he belonged, and in that cabin, deep in the wilderness where the world rarely ventured, Clara Whitmore and Elias Kane began a new life, not bound by the rules of the city or the fears of the past, but by the wild, untamed love they had chosen together.